Hello and welcome to another one of Wealthfare's interview. Today we have another very special founder with us, a very special entrepreneur. We have with us Mr. Narendra Agarwal, who is both the co-founder and chief marketing officer of Testbook. Welcome, sir, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. My pleasure.
All right. So I'm going to start right at what Testbook is about. It was founded in 2013, and Testbook currently has more than 1 crore app installs. Can you tell us how Testbook has grown as a startup in the last 7 years and what Testbook actually does?
Sure, yeah, sure. So we provide study material, or you can say we are helping students prepare for government recruitment exams in India. We cater to around 200 examinations in India in this sector, and especially like banking, SSC, railways, defense, and all these sectors. Our target audience is majorly tier three, tier two audiences, and we have like we when we started in 2013, the focus was government exams. Obviously, we started with one exam. I think the first exam that we did was GATE examination, which helps for like higher education and engineering sector, plus all your PSU entrance, etc. We did that. We got very early good traction around the product, and subsequently we kept on adding more and more exams. And that's how currently we are providing almost 200 examinations. But I think when we started, so yeah, one thing was very clear for us that we were bootstrapping. So I graduated from IT Bombay in 2012. I did another startup for 1 year before starting Testbook, and we knew that it would be slightly longer journey for us because we didn't had that much, you can say, investor connect at that point, and we didn't understood that ecosystem. It was a bit early, like it was 2012, 2013. Startups were not really a norm at that point, right? So we thought, okay, let's bootstrap this, and we started focusing on channels or marketing channels, which we knew we can grow from first low investments, and then those channels are like could be a high ROI channels for us. So we focused on a lot on content marketing, developing organic traffic for the website. We focused a lot on referral, getting the right referral set up. I think that was we experimented a lot. It was not a day one success, but I think we finally got it together. We also launched another app for current affairs, because current affairs is like a common element across all these examinations, and we wanted to cater to that particular section differently. So we did that, and that helps us achieve a lot of organic growth. I think still that app gets like 5-6 thousand new installs on a daily basis without any like specific marketing done for that. And that is there. Apart from that, I think like most of the founding team has come from small towns. So we understand what is a requirement our student base has, right? And we have focused on that core consumer group. At the same time, we understand that since it's an educational product, uh, not only our product needs to be the best in the market, our content also needs to be the best in the market. So I think currently, like, the largest team we have in the organization is content team. So we focus a lot on providing the right content, getting the right format for that content out, and I think that has helped us achieve the growth over the last 5-6 years that we have.
Amazing, amazing, truly amazing. You talked about growing for the last 7 years. You started from 2013. I'm pretty sure with all the success that you have gotten, there would have been a couple of setbacks, a couple of disappointments. So my question is, as a co-founder, what all entrepreneurial learnings did you come across? What all did you learn while being the co-founder, while overcoming these past obstacles?
Sure, yeah, sure. So I think like every startup journey is always like there are a lot of ups and downs, but I think ultimately when you're starting, it comes down to the team that you have in place, right? How strong is how strong and how passionate is a team about solving that particular problem statement that you have, because at that day when things are not going as per your plan, right? Only that passion and that strong bonding will help you survive that day. And obviously, there were like 2 3 very you can say critical points in our journey where we had to really you can say really power through that period. And I remember still I think there was a phase around 5 6 months, around 4 years 4.5 years back. So we ran out of cash. We were around 35 people in the team at that moment. And it was really a struggle to like, how do you pay salaries? There are like so many people dependent on you and so on. And I think we survived for around 5 6 months. We everybody like really focused on the getting like more revenues for the company. Finally, we raised a small round, and that helps us get through that period. But that was like the most magical, I think you can say, 6 months we had, because that bonded the entire team like a family, because everybody was so strong at that point. I think that is our second year. I think as first time founders, we are living this journey for the first time, right? So a lot of times our focus is either very short term or either very long term. So I think one should always have like 3 set of goals or 3 set of plans. One is always your like extreme short term, like what are you doing in next 1 month, 2 month, 3 month. One is extreme long term, which is like your 5 years, 7 years plan, right? And one should be around like what are you doing in next like couple of years. If you're having all these three very clearly, you understand, okay, this is what I'm trying to achieve in 2 years, this is what I'm trying to do in 3 months, and this is what I'm trying to achieve in 5 6 years, right? Then you can really pace your organization accordingly. Otherwise, if you like just focus on short term, you might lose on the long term, or if you just focus on long term, you might not achieve the numbers in short term. And yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
So that's fantastic. So you spoke about raising a small round, right? Since then, Testbook has gone on to raise rounds further, and Testbook has also managed to raise quite a bit of money from both angels and venture capitalists. So is there a difference between what an angel investor seeks to achieve in terms of growth rate versus what a venture capitalist seeks to achieve in terms of growth rate, the speed at which that growth rate takes place, etc.? And how does the workload on a startup get affected once they've been funded in from money that's coming from outside, and once it's no longer running on its own money?
So I think yeah, that expectation bit now. So expectation, of course, varies with I think idea to idea, startup to startup, and of course from investor to investor, right? But generally, I think when angel investors are taking a bet on you, uh, that bet is essentially on the team, right? So, because at that moment, uh, company is very young, traction is hardly anything, right? At the same time, when VCs are entering into the company, I think that stage is the stage of the company is different. You generally have a bit more mature product. You're looking for scaling the company from that point, right? And VCs are coming with that scaling experience because they have done it across other sectors with other companies. So yeah, I think expectation is definitely different. Angels are not really, you can say, for them it's more that the company should at least survive next 2 3 years, right? Because at that stage, almost 99% of the companies will not survive. Whereas when VCs are coming, they are essentially looking for growth, right? Whether the company can grow like 10x, 15x, depending on the idea from their investment. So that's what I think. Expectations are definitely different. Now, as far as I think the workload is concerned here, I think as a founder, your workload uh, never really decreases. It always increases. But I think the nature of the work definitely changes a lot over time. I think when you're a very small team, you're doing a lot of things yourself, right? As team matures, as you have better, you can say, more skilled people in the organization, the kind of work that you are doing keeps on changing. And ultimately it evolves to become like more and more strategic input, and more about essentially keeping uh, trying to understand the teams are going, roadblock for them, trying to solve roadblock, running the end-to-end work yourself.
Right. So you spoke about how 99% of the startups don't actually make it, don't actually survive. You also spoke about the workload which goes into a startup. My next question is that what I've observed is that many startups tend to seek funding really quickly. As soon as they start, they tend to seek funding. Do you think that is advisable? And secondly, being the co-founder, what are some prerequisites which you have in mind, which you keep in mind while seeking funding from outside?
Yeah, I think again, like whether you want to whether you want to raise funding or don't want to raise funding, I think it again depends a lot on the idea that you are chasing, right? A lot of ideas don't really require funding, and in that case, if you start chasing that fundraise activity, you will actually waste a lot of time, because it takes around 3 to 6 months to do even a small fundraise, right? And but at the same time, I think a lot of startups are pursuing an idea where I think external capital is definitely required, and you cannot really do justice to that idea without that. So I think it actually depends, but yeah, I think, yeah, as far as prerequisites are concerned, you should not raise funding until and unless you have a clear understanding that where this money will be utilized, or how you utilize this money for growth or for achieving the next milestone, right? Until and unless you have a clarity on that, you should not go for that. uh, of course, you cannot really raise without having a clear understanding, because investors will ask you tons of questions. But second year, I think, as like in the early stage, right, when you're like extremely early in the journey, a lot of people try to raise funds without having a like product ready, or a like these at least some traction ready, right? Which until and unless you are having I think really good connections in the angels, or until and unless you are having past history, right? It becomes very difficult, and uh, handling that rejection becomes then tricky, because if you are hearing no from so many people, right, you start doubting yourself. Whereas that no is just coming from investors' perspective. It's not a no on you, right? So I think until and unless you have like a product market fit, and you really think, okay, this, if I raise this much capital, I can achieve this in like 6 months, 12 months, whatever, 18 months period, right? Then you should really go for it. Otherwise, you should not.
That's great. So the one thing that I caught from that is you spoke about how important it is to know about their own company, the own objectives that they have for their own companies. And Testbook is of course a participant in one industry that is both booming and highly competitive, which is of course the edtech space, where we've seen startups come and go day and night. There are few players that have stayed through that game, and one of them is of course Testbook. So, can you tell us a little bit about what Testbook's USP is that has allowed it to survive such a brutal industry? And how is it different compared to the other players out there?
Sure, yeah, sure. So I think our USP has been same since the start, right? So we really focused on the student's outcome, because when we started, we knew that until and unless our product and our content is able to move the needle on a student's outcome, we will not survive. And with that, yeah, I think we have essentially what we try to do is like each of our product features, content, we try to set up a lot of feedback mechanisms, essentially, to try to judge whether this is helping a student in terms of improving his scores or not. Uh, for an example, so we have a product called Textbook Pass. It essentially allows a student to get access to around like content for almost 200 examinations. And the idea is there is not to bombard users with like unlimited content. The idea is that for each of these exams that a student might be preparing for, our content should be very streamlined, very comprehensive, at the same time very concise, so that whenever a student is even spending a minute on the platform, right, he is able to make the maximum of that particular minute. Similarly, I think we also introduced this concept for personalized coach around 5-6 months back, and again the agenda was that we got some feedback that as people are moving more towards online, um, that ability to keep that motivation high during that preparation journey is becoming difficult. So we thought, why not connect people, or why not connect aspirants with someone who has cleared the exam before, who has a very good understanding what it requires to clear that particular exam, and then they can speak with that coach and essentially get motivated if they face some motivation issues throughout the journey, right? And that has again really worked very well for us. People really like to speak with someone who has cleared that exam journey and is able to actually clear their doubts at a personal level. So I think ultimately that obsession with the outcomes of the student has been our USP. Yeah.
Great. So, to be in the edtech space, you have to be very heavy on marketing, in my opinion. Like you have to do it well because you're targeting someone who needs to be captured very effectively. So I wanted to know, as Textbook as a company, they have used both offline as well as online marketing channels to navigate its growth. How have you used both, and between the two, which of these two has had a greater impact?
Okay. So yeah, we have used both, and I think uh, although like digital online has been throughout the journey, offline was we started a bit late. We started early 2016 types, and the focus was very simple. We wanted to penetrate more in our top audiences, you can say. So we focused it towards 4 states: UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, and NCR, Delhi, essentially. And we did a lot of experiments. Offline was new for us also. So we went extremely, you can say, BTL. We did a lot of on-ground activities around coaching hubs and educational hubs, essentially. It really, I would say, it really helped us in establishing Textbook as a like trustable brand for that audience. Before that, people always perceive Textbook as a digital brand, but when you are visible on the ground so many times to the user, right, he starts perceiving you as a brand which is much more trustable, accessible to him. Because if even if, let's say, he faces any issues or any challenges with our products or services, right, he can definitely reach out to the person who is on the ground. So that has really helped us here, and I think uh, I would say to current the grip that we have over the government exam space in terms of these crowd, I think a lot of that credit goes to the offline marketing activities that we did across last 3-4 years.
So that's fantastic. But then there's the other thing, right? We're guessing that because this is in tier 2, tier 3, and even if it would be in tier 1, India is an extremely cost sensitive market where people aren't that free willing to spend any amount of money, no matter how less. So you offered a premium, sort of freemium digital model to them. Did that make it difficult to acquire new paying customers, or did that make it easier through that freemium model? And how did you go about acquiring those customers for yourself through that model to convert them into paying consumers?
Yeah, I think I would say premium has worked very well for us. I think I would say that. Uh, uh, the reason behind that, yeah, I think a lot of, I think majority of the users that we cater to are coming online and doing probably the first transaction with Testbook. So first digital transaction with Testbook, at least for the content piece, right? So they have of course done like other recharge and all those sort of digital transactions, but I think that online content purchase, probably Testbook is the first purchase. And in that sense, if we don't have a freemium model, then it will not allow them to like essentially sample the content, right? And that might become an issue. But the model is such that for each exam we are having some free quizzes, free tests, and there's like a bunch of around 15-20% content is available for free. So which helps them take a very educated guess around whether they want to upgrade for a like paid membership or not. And like we have started these, like when we were doing pre-COVID, we were doing a lot of offline at that time. So we were using the same freemium concept in offline as well, and it helps us get like better conversion rates compared to just directly pitching a paid product. Uh, at the same time, I think a lot of it depends on how you position the product as well. For us, test series and like test assessment is something which if we start selling directly, uh, users will not be able to sample the content that we have, and people, like although people are paying for the product, they, a lot of them feel that they're paying just for the content, and that might become a issue for us. But I think as we are going ahead here, I think a lot of our newer products, right, they don't have a freemium offering as such. They directly have a paid plan or purchase plan as such. But the idea there is that a lot of the top funnel for that new services are dependent on the uh, current paid audiences that we have. So that again works well in our case.
Okay, amazing. One more thing is that right from its conception in 2013, Testbook has grown incredibly well. It has more than 1 crore app installs currently. It's present in multiple cities across India, and it is thriving in a very competitive market. But when you grow at such an incredible speed over time, I'm sure it comes with its own set of challenges, which are quite different. So how do you tackle these challenges when it comes to consumer focus and adding value, keeping on adding value to your content?
So I think I briefly touched upon this earlier, but I think when we are scaling, so like apart from the tech challenges and all, I think one of the major challenge that we face is how do we scale the content in that fashion. So let's say if I was doing 100 exams 1 year back, now I'm doing 200 exams, and let's say if I plan to do 300 exams in next 6 months. So how do I scale my content in that fashion? So I think uh, being able to do a good quality control becomes very critical. You can of course hire experts, and you can bring those people in the team to like share your workload, etc. But ultimately, what content is going towards the consumer, right? That needs to be uh, in a way like high quality, right? So what we have done is, yeah, we have essentially set up a lot of you can say feedback loops from the end consumer to the creator that we have. So let's say if some subject matter experts is designing a test paper, right? So generally what happens is like a test paper has like 5-6 contributors in house. So each contributor would be contributing on a particular question type or let's say subject, right? The moment that test paper goes to consumer, of course there are a couple of review cycles done before that. But even after going to the consumer, if there's a let's say a review or a rating on that, right, and if it's not passing our threshold, that is immediately highlighted to the creator. So we have set up it in such a way that each subject matter expert has his own dashboard, and he can see, okay, all my tests are performing at this rating, all my questions are at this rating, and he can actually see, okay, these questions are at low rating, so he can correct those things very quickly. Similarly, on the lectures front, yeah, so all our faculties have their own ratings, dashboards, and all that. So they can really see, okay, in this course, my lectures are being received very well. In this course, okay, this lecture had some issue, right? So let's say if there might be a normal issue, like let's say a lecture started 2 minutes late, right? So that can also get bad reviews from the users. So he's able to essentially see that if there's a fix for it, get it fixed, and so on. So essentially being able to fix things at a very fast pace has really helped us maintain that quality across the amount of content that we are now serving to the user. I think that has, and that has just been because of the team that we have, the kind of you can say obsessiveness we have with the being the best content in the market. And yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So we've spoken about the past and we've spoken about everything Textbook has done to prepare itself for the present. So we of course have to touch upon the present, and no conversation is complete without talking about COVID. So being one of those leading brands in the edtech sector, has this pandemic been a blessing in disguise for Textbook, considering how quickly everyone has had to adapt to online learning? And do you think that that longevity will be maintained, and do you think that that scale will continue to grow in the future, or is this just a spike that will come back down to normalcy and will take some time to grow again?
I think so. Yeah, first of all, the impact on textbook. So I think when the lockdown happened in like around 15 March, sorry. So of course, a lot of exams that we cater to here are very small duration exams. So preparation durations are like 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. And the moment the lockdown happened, there was a dip in the sense of you can say preparation intent of the users, because the exams were postponed. All the exams that were happening in, I think, second half of March, April, May, they got postponed. So whatever impact that we were getting from the COVID and the lockdown was essentially neutralized by this dip in the preparation intent. But we realized that at that moment that it's a short-term effect, because obviously exams are going to be conducted at some point, right? And that point will lead to a huge demand, because all the like missed exams for those 3-4 months will then start happening back to back, and that's what we are seeing in last 3 months. All our numbers are on increase, and the traction is almost double of the pre-COVID time. So while that is there, uh, I think that there's a at least edtech can be divided into, yeah, 3-4 different pieces, and for the segment that we are in, I think this shift is sort of permanent. Because for us, our sector, the offline parallel was offline coaching institutes, and I think almost all coaching institutes, either they have also moved to a online offering, or they have shut down their services. Right? These two things have happened. So I think this shift, at least for our sector, is sort of permanent. There might be, of course, some dip as situation normalizes, but I think over that time this is going to be the norm. But yes, I think the other sectors like K-12, scaling, and all, I think their curves would be different. I think especially K-12, although like the peaks are very high, but I think as situation improves and as more schools start operating, there would be some dip. But still, yeah, I think once people start seeing the benefits of online education, I think uh, there's not no going back here. I think a lot of people have started have got access for like high quality teachers for the first time. I think which probably wouldn't have been possible for them given in the like location they are in and things like that, right? So they are always going to opt for this, and plus it's also cheaper. Yeah, I think if you're preparing for exam like IIT or medical, right? To get access to top quality teachers, you would have to spend at least 2-3 lakhs per year, whereas the same quality teachers are now available to you at probably 20,000, 30,000 rupees per year basis. So I think that shift is going to be still permanent, but yeah, I think it will have some different impact compared to us.
Great. So that brings us to the last question of the day, and it's quite an interesting one. The edtech space seems to be a wave that every company seems to be riding on. It has been on a boom for the last couple of years, and it is destined to rise exponentially for years to come. So, keeping this in mind, what does the future hold for Testbook?
Very interesting, yeah, very interesting question. So I think uh, I think EdTech is at a point where probably uh, e-commerce was at the start of the decade in India. I think next decade is going to be EdTechs. I think there would be a lot of big companies to be made in this space. India's entire overall EdTech market is very big, and it is even going to increase further only. Given that, yeah, I think for us, we want to focus on the core problem statement that we are currently tackling, which is, so we want to be a go-to platform for job seekers. So currently, our target has been the government exam space, where people who are preparing for government jobs are our target segment. But we have started doing some offerings for private jobs as well. And I think going forward, we want to establish ourselves in this space where anybody who's preparing for a job can trust Testbook to provide the best possible route for getting a job.
All right, so that brings us to the end of this interview. And I must say that apart from everything that Testbook has been doing in the education sector, this is probably another one that is allowing people to learn through its own entrepreneurial journey. And we have people like you to thank for to do these interviews with. So thank you so much. And we wish you all the best and much more growing success with Testbook.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.